session titled, welcome to our attendees to this panel session titled Illicit Markets. My name is Eduardo Fiora, and I'm a Director of Strategic Intelligence at the risk advisory firm K2 Integrity. And tonight, I'll be your moderator. Now, before we start with a very interesting panel, just some housekeeping. You, the audience, can ask questions to our panelists. Please feel free to use the Q&A session that's part of Zoom. We'll either address your questions immediately or at the end of the panel, depending on how many questions we get and when we get your questions. Now, back to the panel. The topic of discussion tonight is illicit markets. Now, we know that recent and ongoing conflicts are affecting the stability of international markets and relations, but the global economy seems to be providing opportunities for individuals, communities, and businesses, and it continues to provide opportunities for criminal networks who continue to engage in counterfeiting, trafficking, and all sorts of illicit activities. We know that illicit trading harms the economy and consumers, who are consequently exposed to substandard goods, harmful goods potentially. And tonight, that's exactly what our panel will discuss. On our panel, we have Dr. Kamila Lienage, who's a specialist in terrorism and political violence. Kamila is a research contributor to the Global Network on Extremism and Technology at GNet in London, and is affiliated with various other prestigious institutes, which I do not have the time to list because there's many. Helith Ravenholm is also one of our panelists tonight. She's an independent researcher and anthropological consultant. She's based in France. Her chief research interests are an intersection of technology, minorities and crime, identity, and material culture, as well as human-animal relations. We then have Dr. Maria Joffre, who's a postdoctoral research fellow at Transcrime in Milan. She's an expert in machine learning and corporate data analytics, among other things. And she's also actively involved in various EU-funded projects in the security domain. And last but not least, we've got Professor Rashmi Singh. She's a professor of international relations at PUC Minas in Brazil, and holds a PhD from the LSE in London. She's also co-founder and co-director of the Research Network on Terrorism, Radicalization, and Transnational Crime, TRAC. These are our panelists tonight, and we're due to have a really interesting discussion, which is essentially to start now. And we start with Kamila. Now, Kamila, I understand that much of your research recently has focused on the nexus between counterfeiting and the rise of authoritarianism, which we have actually been seeing quite a lot of recently. Can you tell us and the audience more, please? You're still on mute, Kamila. Sorry. You should be able to unmute from the bottom left of the screen. On Zoom. Apologies to the audience for the slight hiccup.
I think you can hear me now.
Yes, that's fantastic. Thank you, Kamila. So the floor is all yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Kamila Lienage. The inspiration of this study came from the ground reality. As the situation became very clear, I started to investigate it, applying the scientific method. To give it a bit of a background, I went to Sri Lanka on holiday in 2022. What caught my eye was that the prevalence of expensive brands, from clothes to shoes and bags, It was like a visual overload of Cartier to Guess. People like fine things. So quite clearly, finer things are being delivered to meet the exponential demand. It was a delivery of fake in industrial scale. It's all counterfeit, but good in quality compared to the local market produce. But of course, those fakes are far from the quality of the original products. So after witnessing the problem, I asked a simple question to start the study. How counterfeit swarm the market in industrial scale? We started to investigate the domestic supply chain of counterfeit, conducting face-to-face discussions. The target group was traders, wholesalers, local guides, and consumers of the fake products. The domestic supply chain was quite simple. Traders placed their orders with the wholesaler through a phone call. A truck every Friday delivers the products, and then they pay and place items for sale. That's it. Once our investigation started, it was revealed that the local supply chain is connected to a wholesaler at Manning Market in Colombo. Local traders revealed details freely. As we observed, they never felt guilty of selling counterfeit because they bought the products. And the cultural awareness of counterfeit was relaxed. People see things as original or not original. Originals are expensive, not originals are affordable. That's it. It was not seen as a crime. It was not something secret or something to feel guilty about. Not originals are everywhere in large bazaar markets in Sri Lanka for many decades, but the context is different now. Counterfeiting is an emerging criminal market in Sri Lanka, as revealed by the Global Organized Crime Index in 2023. We had to take precautions when we go to the main distributor of the supply chain. There are only few clothing wholesalers in the Manning Market in capital city of Colombo. Our empirical evidence guided us to one of those wholesalers. In the multi-story building of the wholesaler, there was a sea of counterfeit products in plastic wrappings, mostly clothing, shoes, and bags. It was just an open place in a bustling marketplace, not any kind of secret location, as you have imagined. Wholesaler was relaxed and open about selling counterfeit. He buys products from the local importers who import counterfeit products from China, India, and Vietnam. After obtaining counterfeit products with luxury brand logos, the wholesaler owned the items by stitching his own brand tags inside the collar of clothing products. Outside the visible luxury brand logos, inside his own brand tags. It gives him a sense of ownership of the product, and he was proud of his own brand, though there were eye-catching luxury brand logos to tempt the consumers. Once our investigation started, it was revealed that So what are the findings of the study? To understand the findings, especially in its context, we need to focus on political and economic power dynamics behind counterfeit in Sri Lanka. It's not limited to counterfeit, as it is fast becoming just one leg of a vast shady enterprise, from drug trafficking, human smuggling, money laundering, to offshore wealth rooted in corruption. Counterfeit has been a much better option, as it's still not seen as a criminal business. However, the main criminal enterprises such as drug trafficking, human smuggling, and money laundering with links to transnational organized crime networks cannot function without strong political ties in the domestic setting. This is fast becoming a requirement to counterfeit trade too. In fact, it has been the common knowledge for decades that local mafia and crime kingpins are often the confidants of local politicians and ministers. And these high-level state officials started to take part or have shares of lucrative businesses tied to corruption and criminal products. As we learn from the wholesaler in the Manning market, authorities have ordered the wholesalers to stop selling products with original brand logos after May 2023. A conglomerate owned by a powerful actor, actually a former minister with strong political ties, has obtained the brand ownership. The people behind this conglomerate are well known for their illicit dealings. Lucrative markets are taken over by powerful networks. Petty players can't compete with them. Actors in multi-leg criminal enterprise are politically powerful. They network with illegal business and service supply chains all over the world. They have transnational connections for products, services, and even to stash their ill-gotten gains in offshore tax havens. After the petty players of counterfeit market were removed, what will happen next is yet to be seen. Then when it comes to conclusion, we cannot understand counterfeit market in Sri Lanka without considering first its domestic and second, its international context. We highlighted that it's not possible to run criminal markets in the country without established political power. Then how does the international context affect criminal market in Sri Lanka? Our world is now defined by the global rise of authoritarianism in the post-9/11 context. Authoritarianism is criminal as it's not governed by the rule of law. This is the same about kleptocracies, mafia states, hybrid regimes, and some flawed democracies with autocratic tendencies. Sri Lanka is a flawed democracy according to the rankings of the Economic Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index in 2022. Sri Lanka is a flawed democracy with a strong Chinese influence. It also has domestic criminal networks operating from UAE with links to transnational organized crime. We cannot ignore the strong hand of state-embedded actors in Sri Lanka when it comes to transnational organized crime. We cannot also ignore the context of the global rise of authoritarianism directly affecting domestic scene in Sri Lanka. For example, the Chinese influence as a cheap counterfeit supplier, the autocracy in UAE allowing politically powerful Sri Lankan criminal networks to operate from there. The state-embedded actors benefiting from the lapses of the rule of law in other autocracies to multiply their criminal potential worldwide. These indicators explain both domestic and international context where counterfeit trade and other forms of transnational organized crime thrive. As the state-embedded actors have a strong hand in organized crime, increasingly including counterfeit trade, we must not be surprised if these actors take steps to maximize their criminal potential. because that's how they work, that's their craft. Sooner or later, the powerful actors take steps to absorb lucrative illicit markets, such as counterfeit trade. So what we can learn in the context of the global rise of authoritarianism, criminality fast becomes a weapon of the state. So in autocracies, kleptocracies, hybrid regimes, mafia states, and in some flawed democracies, regimes and regime-linked actors must not be trusted as reliable partners in the fight against counterfeit and other forms of transnational organized crime. That's all. Thank you for your attention.
Camila, thank you for your great presentation. If I may, I actually have one question. Now, you've obviously focused your research on Sri Lanka, but during the course of your research, have you come across any other jurisdictions that you thought sort of could compare to the situation in Sri Lanka? And perhaps if you were to expand the remit of your study, which other jurisdictions would you be inclined to consider, just briefly before we move on to the next presentation?
I think it's mostly there's a huge supply chain that is spread all over the world, especially this United States border force. I think they have a list of countries that send lots of counterfeit to US. So they mentioned China as one of the biggest supplier of counterfeit in the world. So I think it's not one place, it's like a huge supply chain with distributor points like China, sometimes India and Vietnam. I think it's all over the world. We can't say it's one country or another, but when their rule of law is weak, so these practices increase. So that's how it works. So there's no rule of law. The lapses of rule of law brings out all this, all kinds of organized crime, including counterfeit.
That's great. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation, Camila. Thank you. And for those who have joined since the beginning of the session, just be reminded that you're more than welcome to ask questions in the Q&A function of this webinar. Now, moving on, we've just talked about essentially the link between counterfeit and authoritarianism, which is quite pragmatic. But we've got Heldit Ravenholm, who's actually going to talk about something that's a bit more subtle and has to do with something that we touch every day, but perhaps we don't realize, which is the internet. And I want to ask Heldit one question, which is, our day-to-day essentially relies on the use of the internet, on the use of servers. How is this affecting illicit trade?
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Eduardo. It most certainly does affect illicit trade. My focus mostly is on minorities and the impact of illicit trade, and especially hate, organized crime, and connection of terrorism and hate to minorities. So we're going to see a little bit of that as well. But yes, internet is most definitely heavily impactful when it comes to illicit trade. Let me just try and share my presentation. Let's go back to the start. Can you all see it?
I think we can all see it, so feel free to bring it to full screen.
I'm going to do my best. Come on, screen. It does not want to. Why does it not want to? That is silly.
At the bottom right, you should be able to press on the little presentation.
Yes, exactly, but it's not.
It's not working.
Nope. I'm really sorry about that.
That's fine. We can all see regardless.
We'll go from that. So now, illicit weapons trade accounts for around $1 billion yearly. That's the approximated value of trafficked arms and light weapons per year, according to the 2021 GI-TOC report. I should probably add that in the next few days, I'll probably have a handout. There was supposed to be a handout, but then my computer crashed, so I couldn't actually prepare it. It is considered to be one of the most dangerous parts of illicit trade, and it's obviously on the rise, though the current market in Europe continues to be relatively small, according to Europol. Cases in the last few years, however, showcase a disturbing trend that is likely to change that, as well as create a whole new niche of illicit weapons trade. Now let's shortly look at the cases in question. In 2019 in Halle, Germany, the perpetrator downloaded blueprints from the internet, partly manufactured the weapon, and shot 2 people to death. 2021 in Spain, the Policía Nacional raided and dismantled a workshop on Canary Islands that was producing 3D printed weapons. This workshop also had manuals on urban guerrilla warfare and white supremacist literature. Just a month later, 2 men and 1 woman were arrested in the UK in connection with right-wing terrorism. All 3 were charged with possessing 3D printed weapons parts. In 2022, Slovakia, a suspect was arrested for possessing a similar ideology-related literature, was found to be spreading hate speech online, was in possession of 3D printed weapons, and was associated with an online group that presented a real threat offline as well. In US and Canada, there have been notable movements that lean towards 3D printing. Reasons vary, but a lot of people involved are involved with either specific ideologies or opposing matters such as gun control or government specifically. As we know from Europol, the arms trafficked for European use can be for private use most of the time, not just associated with conflict and criminal underworld, which I think makes sense considering the small market. 3D weapons are a gateway into privatizing illicit trade weapons. The motive is often connected to ideological beliefs. I'm sorry, it's very late here. Spread wide and often unchecked on the internet. Despite rising understanding on all these topics, the online world is still considered an unconnected sphere without any quote-unquote real impact on the real world. Now, today I want to look at this topic. We don't have a lot of time. I'm going to do my best. And obviously, organized crime, as we know, intersects with hate. It intersects with minority rights, intersects with terrorism. So let's go on to the next slide. Online hate speech has been connected to real life crimes. It has been connected to harassment. It has been connected to murder. But the interesting part is that, especially if you consider that it has been connected to murder, we are still considering internet to be something less real. We often hear arguments that the laws don't apply or do not apply in the same way. Now, why is that the case? Speaking as an anthropologist, realness is a complex sociocultural phenomenon. We could spend hours on it. What is real can be down to a social and cultural agreement on what counts as real rather than de facto existence or presence. We see that well, for instance, in conspiracism and in culturally present accusations of, for instance, witchcraft, where commonly held perceptions of the world design a socially communal belief rather than base of provable facts. Witchcraft, for instance, if I stay with that, will be deemed a real offense because it is believed to exist even if no other proof is present. The proof will be found through bias and belief in existence of witchcraft. It's a chicken and egg problem, if you wish. With the internet, the division into the real world and online world initially arguably served to delineate the world we inhabit and the world we could occasionally dabble into. But for many, this divide has become even deeper, creating almost a parallel world where often anything goes. And I believe this is how we socially came to consider online not to be real or as real. And legal framework can actually definitely reflect sociocultural beliefs. Arguably, this is what makes the internet such a wonderful hub for all manners of illicit exploitation. Not only are we arguing whether or not our interactions online are real or have real consequences, we often argue how much of them should be held to account by extant legal standards. We pretend that precedent doesn't exist when the differences are merely a technicality. Say, for instance, if you take revenge porn, it took a while for it to be outlawed. I don't believe that all countries have. I don't think there's control for it everywhere. Similarly, even explicit threats uttered online are often dismissed under a twisted version of freedom of speech, despite the fact that we know, for instance, especially female journalists have actually become victims of real life murders after having been threatened. And obviously, keeping the internet less real has positive impact on those who are dealing in hate or who are dealing in terrorism and illicit markets. One of the GI-TOC papers I quote discusses how there exists nowadays a complex relationship between criminal underworld and the upper world of politics and business, and how they blur in the distinction between legal and illicit. And equal blur exists in our behavior about online and offline. And obviously, this will result in dismissal or minimizing or tackling threats while they are online. A strong threat is also the interconnectedness of politics, where basically you're going to have politicians who are going to have a voter base who actually believes this, who actually taps into this. Distribution of materials, or for that matter, weapons that are related to those discussions, to the people who are actually that voter base, actually becomes pretty much necessary. And obviously the reach on the internet as well is huge. It's much, much bigger. So the issues with supply chain that exist, because this is also a form of supply chain, actually change. There is a huge impact of internet violence on minorities, even where we're just talking about hate speech, we're just talking about threats, we're just talking about cases where politicization of minority identities has actually gone into dangerous territory. Why this is so important in illicit trade is that through 3D printing, through illicit trade in weapons, groups that are actually interested in abuse, in destruction of minorities, are actually capable of reaching for weapons when actually they feel that they should. There is definitely a clear connection between online and offline hate. Offline can actually be considered as a platform for spreading hate that has a real impact just as much as online. And there's a need for innovative solutions that include stepping up advocacy for minorities. Now, for a little case study, one of the people that I interviewed within this year was an African man, an LGBT man, educated, who, with the group that he was trying to defend as a person of a specific background, he was literally told to leave his country, and he had to continue going because they weren't actually allowed to settle anywhere. And once they did, they ended up in a country that was at that particular point safer. They ended up in a situation where nobody was helping them, even in a refugee camp as refugees. And one thing that was definite was that there was incitement towards violence online in his home country. And while I don't believe, from what I know, that 3D printed weapons or other weapons were involved, definite incitement towards killing him, or actually it was definitely present, him and other people like him. So that is something to consider when we actually talk about how illicit trade and minority rights and hate groups and organized crime coincide. As for the solutions, I believe that this is complicated. There is no simplistic solution for a problem this huge. I think better laws, agreement on cyber laws, on what goes, what doesn't go, on international level as well as national level is necessary. On the ground, impact as reported as informant, for instance, with him, they were actually discussing how they tried to counter the hate speech that was present in the society around them by actually spreading positive influence. Like, for instance, they were actually growing their own food and they were sharing it even with people who were attacking them. So there is actually space for this. Stronger international sanctions towards crime online are definitely necessary, which I suppose goes to what Camilla was saying about political interactions. International protection for minorities, including sexual minorities, has become crucial, and change in social and cultural behavior against the realness of online world, I think, is actually really necessary. This obviously should lead to legislative changes. I believe that we are just looking at the start. With technology growing further and further and further, and very often with very little oversight, there is very little knowledge of what we're going to be looking at in illicit weapons trade in the next little while, I believe. But I think if we consider crimes that can be committed against other human beings, if we take, for instance, human rights as our basic line of thought, then we can probably start to work on an international and national legislative step-by-step policy to combat that. That's it for me right now.
Elliot, that's incredibly fascinating. Thank you very much. I think we all appreciated it. Just a very quick question from my end in no more than 2 minutes, just so we stick to our outline. Does the dark web play a role in all this? I mean, with the weapons, with the online hate?
That is a fascinating question, and I'm really glad you brought this up. On the one hand, yes, this is the traditional place where you actually go to find dark web. But from what I've been given to understand, both by informants and what I've actually read thus far, very often a lot of discussions are actually happening on social media. This isn't happening just on dark web anymore. People are feeling safe enough to have discussions, to share these blueprints, essentially in, if you want, normal people web. So this is actually something that to me is indicative that this problem is getting bigger and bigger, and that we do definitely need to address it.
That's great. So thank you very, very much for your answer and for your great presentation. And once again, I invite those in the audience to submit their questions in the Q&A function. We'll address all your questions at the end of the session. Now, on to an equally interesting presentation. We've got Dr. Maria Jofre, who has, her recent research has focused on the nexus between the use of cryptocurrencies, which of course is becoming way more prominent, and right-wing extremism. So I'd like to basically find out through Dr. Maria Jofre how bad actors leverage these new technologies to grow their operations. And so the floor is all yours, Maria.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, and thank you for pronouncing my name so well. Hello, everybody. Thanks also for the organizers, and also thanks to the attendees for participating in this great session. And I hope to answer your question, Eduardo, through my presentation. If not, just jump in. And okay, so today I'm going to talk about the financing of right-wing extremism through cryptocurrency. This is a research activity that is part of the CTC project. CTC stands for CADCORD, which is a EU internal security fund police funding scheme. And yeah, so I will give you the coordinates of the project at the end if you want to know a little bit more about this. This is a joint research along with my great colleagues Nico Nazzari and Alberto Azziani. So I hope I presented well in their behalf. I have to, sorry, wait, there it is. So there's a lot I want to discuss today, so I'll keep it brief, every part of my presentation. But I hope that you agree with me that, well, extremism is wrong, of course. But there are so many claims from different actors saying that extremists and terrorist financiers are actually including new technologies into their funding portfolio. So the main idea is that they still trust traditional systems, but they are incrementing the use of new technologies such as cryptocurrencies for funding their activities. It is particularly of interest because it seems that right-wing extremists are quite are exploiting these vulnerabilities more than others, since they are often banned from accessing traditional instruments. Let's remember back in 2017, I think, yeah, the 17th, that PayPal released this public announcement saying that they are going to do like the war against white supremacists. And what they did was to freeze all the accounts that they identified to be associated to these different groups. And as I mentioned, cryptocurrencies are of a special interest because, as you know, they guarantee a greater anonymity, not 100%, but greater anonymity compared to the traditional financial instruments. However, we believe that empirical evidence is lacking to support these claims, and we thought it was a good opportunity to address this knowledge gap because we have access to blockchain technology, as one of our partners is a blockchain technology provider. We based our study on these investigations. So the Southern Poverty Law Center that I believe is located in Alabama, in the US, these guys have a group that is called Hate Watch, which are constantly monitoring and exposing the activities of right-wing extremists in the US. And they do conduct several investigations along the year. One of them is this about how white supremacists actually make use of cryptocurrencies. They do this analysis through blockchain tool, and I'm going to show you in a second what they have found. The cool thing about this investigation is that these guys actually publish the data set. So they actually compile a data set of entities, so groups and people that were known that were white supremacists or right-wing extremists. And they identify cryptocurrencies and addresses related to these people. And they publish this CSV file in their webpage, and everybody can actually download it. They did a very comprehensive analysis on the 7 most prominent right-wing extremists of the US. And what they did is that they tried to understand the transaction activities of all the addresses associated to these people in a time window. And what they tried to understand is that how much they receive against how much they have sent to analyze the entry and the outcome of their strategies, right? However, we believe that this data set and what you can get from this data set could be expanded. So we try to do that. We extracted all the CSV data set that I was mentioning before. We cleaned it, we processed it a little bit, and we ended up with 556 cryptocurrency addresses from 3 different blockchains, including Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Litecoin. And these 556 addresses were associated to 97 right-wing extremist groups, okay? Considering all these addresses, we could extract information about 75K transactions, cryptocurrency transactions, of course. We use ScoreChain, which is the tool that I was mentioning before, which is a partner of CTC project. And we use this technology to extract information about the accounts and the transactions of these addresses. Let me jump right into the results because there are many. And let's start with the descriptive statistics. As I mentioned, we have 97 groups, right? They have associated 556 addresses associated to them, which on average give us around almost 6 addresses per group. Out of these 6 addresses, almost 5 are of Bitcoins. So we have a very important presence of Bitcoin, which is expectable, right? What is interesting is that, however, we also have alternative. We also see the use of alternative blockchain, including Ethereum and Litecoin. 81% of all these groups actually use a wallet addresses, what we call a non-custodian wallet. And 40% of these groups actually use more than one blockchain. So this is quite an interesting result. Out of the 556 addresses, we can link 15% of them to different services. And as you can see here, the most relevant ones are exchanges and payment services. However, we also see some relevant services such as dark web donation and gambling. Let me finalize the descriptive statistics by mentioning what's happening with the transactions. So what is the transaction pattern of these groups? We have that on average, they perform a little bit less than 800 transactions. And what is very, very relevant is that the number of received transactions is much higher than the ones that they send. So there's a disparity there that it's interesting to analyze. In terms of value, what they receive and what they send on average is the same. So the balance is close to zero. But given that this happens in a long period, the increment of the value of the Bitcoin, the change of the value in Bitcoin, makes a profit for them, the sending and receiving, because of this time lapse I was mentioning before, which is quite interesting. And we see that there in this balance value of the US, which is negative, and it's close to 70K. Also, on average, we see that the difference between the first and the last transactions in a month is around 28. So in general, these addresses are operative for a little bit more than 2 years, which give us an average of almost 3 transactions per month. Now, I'm going to show you 3 case studies to understand that even though I just show you a very broad overview of what we have, there are some interesting differences between the cases. And I'm just going to show you very quickly 3 cases, and then I'll stop.
You have more or less 4 minutes, Marie.
Okay, thank you very much, Eduardo. Perfect. So this guy, also known as Whip, he's a very famous right-wing extremist in the US. And as you can see, this guy used almost 40 addresses, so much more than the 5%, the average 5 or 6 that we had before, out of which 100% of them are Bitcoin addresses. So this guy relies on Bitcoin 100%, and almost all of these addresses belong to a wallet. The number of transactions is quite high. So what we see is that this guy receives and sends a lot of transactions very frequently. And that what is interesting is that even the balance at the end of like today is close to zero. The balance in US dollar is it's more than $4 million. So this guy generated a huge profit in a time lapse of around 5 years. And as you can see here, the graph shows that he basically receives and sends in the same quarter. And also interesting is that this spider web that he generates as not only for receiving, but also for sending. The second case is the founder of the Stormfront Forum. He uses a little bit more addresses, so 57 in this case. Almost all of them belong to a wallet. Almost all of them, again, are Bitcoins. Lots of transactions. But even though all these characteristics, the balance at the end is not that big as the previous one. In this case, we also see receive, send, but this pattern seems to be more constant in time. And this guy also generates this spider web, but in a much less complex scheme. Lastly, we see this guy, it's also very famous, Stefan Milunov. I don't know how to say that name, but it's very relevant. And I wanted to finish with this to try to underscore that these guys do not necessarily create complex patterns. So these guys just use 3 addresses, 1 Bitcoin, 1 Ethereum, and 1 Litecoin. So he diversified in terms of blockchain. Most of them are wallet addresses. And what you see here is that even though he uses only 3 addresses, the number of transactions is enormous. So he also made a lot of profit at the end of the donation scheme. And as you can see, he just uses a lot of mixing patterns to receive the money and then to send it to Binance, which is an exchange, and 21 different other addresses, which is quite simple. And as you can see in the graph, okay, thank you. As you can see in the graph, he receives, and after some years, he sends it. So it's quite a different technique. Just to finalize, I think it's quite clear that right-wing extremists, and at least this sample from the US, do in fact adopt technology, and they focus on cryptocurrencies associated with wallets. Bitcoins dominates, but let's not forget the simultaneous use of alternative cryptocurrencies. There is a widespread use of obfuscation techniques, including exchanges and payment services. It's interesting to see that there are different diverse funding patterns, from complex to simple, and distinct strategies of time value. I will stop here and happy to answer any additional questions. I leave you the QR code in case you are interested in the project, as I promised before. And thank you everybody for your attention.
Thank you, Maria. It really was a wonderful presentation, and we do have questions which we will submit at the end of this session.
Perfect.
But thank you for the moment.
Thank you, guys.
And now, last but not least, Professor Rashmi Singh. Now, your research, I think, is really fascinating when I first read about it, because it's actually focusing on factors that, at least I think, are oftentimes underlooked, including geographical factors. So can you explain how you essentially link these geographical factors to illicit flows? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Eduardo. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this will work. All right.
It's working very well.
Thank you so much. Let me start off by trying to answer the question that Eduardo has posed here, by giving you a little bit of context of what exactly this is. This is a paper that is a very, very small part of an extraordinarily large project in which I, with my co-author, were the regional PIs for Latin America in this space. So let me speak to you a little bit about the project first before trying to explain how geography is linked to illicit trade. So the project was our principal investigator for the project is TRAC, or the U.S. Center on Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption at George Mason University, and its Anti-Illicit Trade Institution that started this project a couple of years ago. And the main objective of this project was to understand links between some of the major hubs of illicit trade around the world. Disclaimer here, there are certainly not all of the hubs involved. We had to focus in on a couple of them. And on the basis of our research, come up with policy recommendations that are global, because we note that these hubs of illicit trade are interconnected, and they sort of work off the same series of gaps in policy and practice. And so 4 centers were chosen for this specific stage of the project. Central America with Panama, Guatemala, and Belize, South America, for which I am one of the co-PIs, which worked on the triple border between Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. And the other two were Middle East with a specific focus on Dubai in the UAE, and Eastern Europe with a specific focus on Ukraine. I will add a word here for our Ukrainian partner who did a fantastic job under conditions of extreme pressure and conflict. So very, very difficult research that she was able to conduct brilliantly. And so in Latin America, in the tri-border area, TRAC, which is our track based at PUCMINUS, which is the Collaborative Research Network on Terrorism, Radicalization, and Organized Crime, became the Brazilian partner. And the rest of the spaces were covered by an international team. So before I go into talking about exactly what is the geography and the area that we're speaking of, just a couple of things. This is a very, very small part of a very large chapter, which is a part of the report, which you can find. I'll give you the links at the end of this presentation. And the entire project is based on a combination of primary and secondary sources. So a lot of reports, a lot of literature, but also a lot of interviews with different parties, different institutions, and stakeholders on the ground. So let's start with a little bit of a definition and trying to contextualize what exactly is this area that we're talking about, because I'm basically going to deep dive into a case study that pulls upon some of the main points that my co-presenters here on this panel have already raised in terms of the challenges posed by illicit trade. So tri-border is basically this area, and Brazil has many, many tri-borders, but this particular tri-border that Brazil has is with Paraguay and Argentina. And it is centered in three main cities in each one of these countries. It's Puerto Iguaçu in Argentina, Foz do Iguaçu in Brazil, and Cidade do Leste in Paraguay. The region is also a very important intersection in terms of the major rivers in this area. You have Rio Paraná and Rio Iguaçu, and these two rivers essentially function as a frontier between these three countries. On the north of this part, you can see in this map, is the Itaipu Lake, which is also where the dam is situated. This is basically an area that is considered to be the heart of the Mercosur and one of the areas with the largest amount of water resource in this region. And what is really particular about the TBA is that it combines the benefit of what are porous, isolated, hard to access and monitor borders, but with the presence of urban centers, because there are other spaces that are purely urban and others that are very, very isolated. For example, the Amazon in Brazil. But this is this very interesting combination of a very hard to reach, hard to monitor space, but with extraordinary urban centers here with access to telecommunications, internet facilities, transport, banking services, and therefore a whole host of illicit actors and goods. Now, there are specific characteristics of the TBA which make it such a vibrant hub of illicit trade. First of all is the presence of weak institutions and widespread corruption. So very much like the Sri Lankan case that we've spoken about. But also what we have here is an economy that is entirely, almost, well, not entirely, but hugely buoyed by tourism, thanks to the natural wonder that is the Iguazu Falls. And as a result of that, what we have is this area being a part of a very, very bustling tourist circuit. We also have the presence of two free trade zones, which are critical in our understanding of how illicit flows work. We also have the presence of a heterogeneous migrant population that facilitates remittances to and from this area. And we're looking at specific countries like Lebanon being extremely important here. And there's a link in terms of crime terror to Hezbollah over here. And so, we are looking at how Cidade do Leste, for example, can generate anywhere between $14 to $15 billion annually in commercial transactions. We are also looking, like I said, at a very, very impressive infrastructure of roads, airports. We have 3 international airports that basically connect this region to the rest of Latin America and the rest of the world. We have a very, very intricate banking system. And again, like I said, those porous borders and that mobile border population, which makes monitoring all this illegal activity quite a challenge. And so on this basis, let's very quickly introduce some of the major illicit trades that we can identify in the TBA. I'm not going to go into too much detail because we do not have the time, but this gives you a basic idea of where we are when it comes to the top 5 for each one of these countries. Guns are extraordinarily important. People, drugs, natural resources, and fauna and flora. So we're looking at quite a variation in terms of what are the flows that are going through this region. This is an indication of corruption and the illicit trade environment. Again, it's based on various sources, including GI-TOC. And again, you can look at the tri-border area as divided between Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil, and see how, depending on which index you're looking at, we go from the worst to the best. And in all of these, our illicit trade risk levels are medium and upwards to high. Finally, we're looking at this particular chart. This is interesting because it kind of compares where we are in terms of the trafficking of these material in this region between Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, and this line over here, which is essentially your global average. And as you can see, in most of these illicit flows and trades, at least Brazil and Paraguay hit above the global average in most cases. Argentina is a little bit better, but not by much. And so just some factors. I'm not going to go into this because I do want some time to talk to you about the geography, but just to give you an idea in terms of losses, we're looking at somewhere in the range of 210 billion US dollars in 2020. For Brazil alone, we're looking at 410 billion reais. In terms of illicit cigarettes, we're looking at Brazil's market being inundated with illicit cigarettes. 57% of all cigarettes here are illicit. We're seeing a penetration of this trade by China. Weapon smuggling, very, very interesting trends here. And we're looking at a significant increase in the number of reports that have been made to COAFI about this. And finally, of course, drug trafficking, of which this is a prime area. It's part of the southern route for cocaine movement in the world. And we can see how seizures in this region have grown over 130% over the last 10 years. This is our general environment that enables this problem: money laundering, corruption, and poor governance, market vulnerabilities. And in the middle, as you can see, there is geography. So let's talk a little bit about geography and what are we talking about. So generally speaking, the movement of contraband and illegal goods across these borders essentially uses a combination of land, air, and water transport routes. Just to give you an idea, Paraguay is a landlocked country, but it has a navy that it maintains because it has a very vast network of rivers. And the same rivers actually connect Argentina, Paraguay, and for Argentina, they connect the northern part of the country to the south, as well as to various ports. The land is also important because Brazil is connected from the tri-border area into its ports through land routes.
You have about 3 minutes, Rashmi.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so let me just put it in very, very brief. The way to understand this is in concentric circles. So the first is our formal crossing and our borders of Rio Paraná. We're looking at 40,000 people crossing this bridge over here, the friendship bridge between Brazil and Paraguay. A lot of these guys are called sacaleros because of these plastic bags that they carry. And they are basically the first in a long chain that links into criminal organizations of a larger type. But then we have the informal crossings here because you have clandestine ports all along the river. We have the use of the dam as well. The geographical space is really, really good because they are basically forests on all sides. It's very, very hard to monitor. And the small roads that you can access these spaces with are almost impossible to penetrate. You then have this system of rivers and streams. And as you can see, these are some of the ways these ports are used. And essentially from the mainland and the water crossing, these are the ways that we can move this material. and it's state infrastructure that is often used. Private plantations are used to dump material, and we see specific trades are using specific modalities and modes and routes of transport, although there are some crossovers here. As we move further afield, one of the things that we see is that the tri-border area is linked to various ports across Latin America. I'm going to speak only specifically about Brazil because of lack of time. In terms of Brazil, traditionally, there have been two ports that have been connected to the TBA. Santos in near the city of Sao Paulo, and Paranaguá in the state of Paraná. And this is a very important link between the Atlantic and the Pacific via the tri-border area. But we are also seeing how newer ports are emerging as important as the security is tightened in Santos and Paranaguá. So we are looking at smaller ports across Brazil, but we are also looking at things like Montevideo in Uruguay and Buenos Aires in Argentina emerging. And this is very, very different from, for example, the ports that used to be used in Colombia or Chile that have increasingly come under observation. We're also
please wrap it up, Rashmi.
Thank you. We're also seeing the use of these various land routes where containers are accessed and contaminated. And I will not go into the details here. Very, very quickly, the last couple of things to say. These are some of the countries where we find illicit actors in this region from. And this is extremely important because when we start looking at the scope of actors, these are just the local actors in the space, but everywhere beyond this, we are looking at criminal groups that are made up exclusively of one nationality, groups that are identifiable by names such as FARC or PCC. And the third category that we can talk about are the entrepreneurs who are basically mercenaries and work for anybody for any money that they will get as brokers and transporters. And so I'm not going to go into this last example that I have, but just to show you the pictures that are beautiful, to give you an idea of how this then becomes a hub to move outwards to different parts of the world. This was an example of cocaine. And so let me just wrap up by saying what we are seeing here is the TBA as a major hub. We're looking at illicit flows being assisted by key actors in specific environments. We're looking at how these flows actually use the same series of routes and modalities. And so what we have in a nutshell is polycriminality, convergence of crime, and an increased role of hubs as a space of concern if you're looking at illicit flows in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rashmi, for an incredible presentation. I think your research is fascinating, to say the least. And once again, I invite anyone who has questions to submit that now. Now really is the time for questions. And if I may, I actually want to go back very briefly to Maria. You have shown us some very interesting graphs, actually, which showed the month by month the receipt of transactions to these 3 case studies that you picked, and one question that we had was there a correlation between sort of spikes in the receipt of these funds and events such as adverse events, attacks, or was there any sort of correlation that you noticed?
Yeah, thank you, Eduardo. Thank you, Rashmi and Helith, for your questions, because I think they're kind of related. The cool thing about this data set is that you actually find in one column a web page that Hate Watch has created for each group. The thing is that we don't have it for all the groups. However, we have it for some very key actors. So what I'm doing now is moving for this very quantitative research into a more qualitative to actually identify what Rashmi is mentioning in her question. So in general, what we see is that they just say we are white supremacists, we stand for this, and if you stand as we do, donate, right? It's not like, I know it sounds silly, but it's not like, we're thinking about attacking the Capitol, so let's raise funds for that. Regrettably, it's not like that. That would be a great thing. Some of these guys have been put in front of the justice, but for specific things that you cannot say, okay, so these 7 years have been, you know, founds of this particular thing. So I will have to dig into these things, of course, not for the 97 groups. First, because we don't have information about them, and second, because of this issue that I was mentioning. But I think it's quite relevant for at least these outliers that I show you, because these are outliers out of the data set, to understand if they actually have related activities with this founding. And thank you for the idea, Rashmi, because we were thinking about, okay, what if we don't find anything? What if we plot law enforcement activities or whatever that has been happening, at least in their geographical scope, at least to manage that. And about connection to arming is the same issue. So we don't know if they receive the money for recruiting, for arming, for, you know, for actually buying, I don't know, other types of material or generating guidelines. We don't have that one-to-one relationship with the money, regrettably. But it's an excellent point. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. I think it's very clear. And actually, I want to ask a question to expand on Helith's presentation as well. So, of course, your presentation was about the link between you know, online hate and how it correlates to, you know, the illicit trade of weapons. But did you by any chance find that it correlated to other forms of illicit trades?
That's complicated, because to a certain extent, I think I would need a lot more resources than I actually have as an independent researcher to really completely 100% say, I can confirm this. But from what I have seen, I would tentatively say yes. I think that where hate interacts with illicit trade, where it interacts with organized crime of any sort, where it interacts with terrorism, of course, we're going to see other trades involved ultimately. So I would love to delve into that, but I think someone is going to have to sponsor my research. That's literally what I can say right now. I'm sorry, it's not a lot.
No, it's good. This is the right forum to actually make these requests. Who knows?
Yes, actually, literally, if anybody wants to sponsor the research, I'm here.
Exactly. I also have a follow-up question for Camila. So you've, of course, looked at the link between authoritarian regimes and counterfeiting. So do you find that there's a correlation whereby the more authoritarian a regime is, the more prone counterfeiting is to be sort of widespread in that regime or jurisdiction?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think there are so many indicators that authoritarianism, because of it's not governed by rule of law, criminality is like intrinsic, right? Criminality is in authoritarian DNA. So especially this I mentioned before, the US Customs and Border Protection Agencies CSIS statistics about counterfeit clearly mentioned that one of the main supplier of counterfeit to the US mainland originated from Hong Kong and China. Both the Chinese mainland and Hong Kong. So I think because authoritarianism tries to, you know, use criminality as a force multiplier to make their opportunities wider, to expand in their opportunities, something like that. And so they don't they are not under this control of rule of law, so they can do anything. Okay, so that's how they work. Okay, I'm this authoritarian country. They fight. They have no norms. They are not under international norms or international values. So under the post-Cold War rules-based world order, breaking rules is their game. That's their craft. So we can't really, because we don't want to be surprised if they try to multiply their opportunities. Either way, by hook or by whatever the means, because they are not under these values, norms, international norms, rules, or not even under the rule of law. So especially this CSIS statistics about counterfeit from US Customs and Border Protection clearly shows there's a link, and there are many more indicators when it comes to various organized crime originating from these authoritarian countries with lack of these lapses of rule of law. So,
thank you, Camila. Yeah, that's incredibly fascinating. And perhaps just one last question for Rashmi, really 2-3 minutes. I mean, you've mentioned actually multiple times during your presentation that this research was essentially huge, and you've only been able to give us essentially a snippet of it. So I want to ask you, also because it looked at so many different jurisdictions, what were the main challenges that you encountered during your huge research effort?
I can only speak for my hub. So the tri-border area, I will not speak for the rest of the team because it was a large international team. But for our hub, we were swamped with information. Primarily, we had to essentially try to choose between so many illicit flows and so many illicit actors to focus upon. And at the end of it, we then decided that we were going to choose drugs and cigarettes to do a deep dive in, leaving out arms, leaving out, things like flora and fauna, human trafficking, which are also enormous in that space, in addition to counterfeiting and all the other things. Primarily because drugs, both cocaine and marijuana, are essentially a high risk and a high consequence illicit flow and involvement, whereas you're seeing in terms of cigarettes, it's a low consequence, high profit, low risk. So in a sense, it was almost trying to juxtapose the risk levels with the profit levels and see how this is working out. And interestingly enough, I'll give you one snippet of a finding in that answer. One of the things that we found is that various actors in this region are diversifying their portfolios. So they're increasingly moving from an involvement in different types of drugs or one kind of drug to a greater involvement or a complete focus on cigarettes, primarily because there is a huge gap in terms of a policy response and in basics such as prison sentencing, if you're involved in drugs versus if you're involved with cigarettes. So that was one of those interesting bits of information that we found.
Of course. Well, thank you for your thorough and accurate reply. I think we're almost at time, sadly. I think it's been an incredibly interesting conversation. So I thank you, panelists, on my behalf and on behalf of all the attendees. I think you've done some incredible research, and I personally feel that I've learned a lot tonight. I wish we had 1 more hour to keep discussing these topics. But I'm sure that if anyone among our attendees is interested in the research that you've done, I'm sure they'll be more than free to reach out to you in the coming days and weeks, and interact and perhaps offer funding for future research. But unfortunately, that's the time that we were given. We've got more panels coming, so I wish once again to thank you. Again, incredible conversation.